Welcome to the deep dive. Our goal here, as always, is to take complex, really critical source material and give you the distilled knowledge, those core insights you need right away.
Mm.
Today, we're opening up the medicine cabinet. We're diving into the world of self-medication, which is just a massive, massive market.
Oh, it's staggering, really. I mean,
Mm.
we're talking about an industry with more than 300,000 over-the-counter products.
300,000, wow.
Yeah, designed to treat, what, over 400 different conditions?
Yeah.
Now, for the consumer, this scale, it feels like convenience, empowerment,
Right.
But for us, for health professionals, it's actually a really deep and complicated challenge.
Uh-huh.
How do we manage these substances that patients often think are perfectly safe just because they don't need a prescription?
That's exactly what we need to tackle today. We've got to cut through the marketing noise, the public perception, and get to the hard reality of these non-prescription drugs, the herbals, the dietary supplements.
Right.
We need to look at the regulatory gaps, the specific risks that are often hidden, and ultimately how patient safety protocols, the nursing process, how that has to adapt to this whole self-care culture.
Okay, so maybe let's start with some quick definitions just to get everyone on the same page.
Good idea.
When we talk about meds that need a prescription, we call those legend drugs. They've got the highest level of scrutiny. Simple enough.
Okay, legend drugs. Got it. Then you've got OTC drugs over the counter. These are the ones legally available without a prescription, usually because they're seen as safe enough for people to manage on their own.
And then critically different from both of those is the dietary supplement. Now, this is a huge category. Vitamins, minerals, herbs, amino acids. Things intended just to augment the diet,
Augment the diet. Okay,
not treat disease.
precisely. And often, patients are mixing all three types. When they use supplements alongside conventional medicine, we call that integrative medicine. Okay, that sets the stage. So let's unpack this regulatory maze around OTCs. Because the history, like you hinted, it's kind of fascinating and maybe a bit concerning.
Really is.
People assume what's on the shelf now has been super rigorously vetted, but that wasn't always the case. The US FDA started this huge OTC drug review way back in 1972.
And that review, well, was a major wake-up call. They were checking the safety and effectiveness of products that were already out there, already being sold for years.
Right.
And what they found was, frankly, shocking. Only about 1/3 of those existing products could initially be called safe and effective for what they claimed to do.
Only a third? Seriously.
Yeah, another third were found ineffective,
Yeah.
and some were just pulled completely. It really shows you the kind of chaos in the market before that review.
Wow. Okay, that context really makes the process of reclassifying a prescription drug, a legend drug, to an OTC drug seem incredibly important then. We've seen big ones make that jump, right? Ibuprofen.
Yep, ibuprofen, some heartburn meds like famotidine, nicotine patches.
So what does it take for a drug to make that switch?
It has to meet really stringent requirements. The basic idea is the consumer has to be able to easily and accurately diagnose their own condition
Okay.
and then monitor if the drug is actually working for them. The drug also needs a low potential for abuse, limited interaction with other common drugs, a pretty good adverse event profile,
Meaning fewer side effects?
fewer serious side effects, yes, and a very wide therapeutic index.
Okay, a high therapeutic index. That means the gap between a helpful dose and a harmful dose is really big.
Exactly. It gives the consumer a massive margin for error, kind of a necessary safeguard if people are dosing themselves.
Makes sense. So if a drug passes all those tests, what are the pros and cons for the healthcare system overall?
Well, the advantages are pretty clear, right? Convenience for patients, they can self-treat minor things, and potentially lower costs. No doctor's visit, no dispensing fees for simple stuff.
Okay, sounds good. But there's always a but,
There is. The convenience comes at a potential cost.
which is the delay, I imagine.
Exactly, that critical trade-off. Relying on an OTC to just manage symptoms might stop someone from seeking professional care for something serious, or maybe a chronic condition that really needs proper medical intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And that delay, that's really the heart of this illusion of safety. People think, I bought it at the supermarket, it must be harmless.
Right.
But that OTC might just be masking the symptoms, not fixing the root cause.
Mm.
And that can dangerously delay getting the right diagnosis and effective treatment.
And we see that danger playing out with some really common things, stuff everyone has. Let's start with maybe the biggest one, acetaminophen, leading cause of acute liver failure.
It is. The risk of liver toxicity with acetaminophen is just huge, which is why that dose limit is absolutely non-negotiable. You cannot go over 3 to 4 grams a day. period.
And it's often accidental, right? Not intentional overdose.
Very often accidental. It's the double dosing trap. Someone takes, say, Tylenol for a headache, and then later takes a multi-symptom cold medicine, not realizing that also has a big dose of acetaminophen in it.
Yeah, you really have to read those labels carefully. What about NSAIDs? Ibuprofen, naproxen, everyone uses those for pain, inflammation.
Staples, yeah.
Yeah.
But they carry a pretty hefty risk profile that people often just ignore. We're talking about GI ulceration, kidney
Or
problems.
kidney dysfunction.
Yep. And even increased risks of heart attack and stroke.
Wow, with common pain relievers.
These are not benign drugs. That's why the FDA has required stronger warning labels on NSAIDs since 2009, really hammering home the cardiac and GI risks, especially if you use them for a long time or at high doses.
Okay. Now, one area where regulations seem to have a big positive impact was with kids' cold medicine, right?
Yes, that was a huge success story, actually. There were numerous reports of really severe side effects in young children.
Like what?
Things like oversedation, seizures, rapid heartbeat, even, tragically, death in some cases. So the FDA recommended against using OTC cough and cold products in kids under 2.
And did that work?
It absolutely did. Studies tracked a really significant drop in ER visits for young kids related to these products once parents got that message and followed the guidance. It shows, informed regulation can make a real difference.
But it's not just about accidents or side effects. There's also intentional misuse, the abuse factor.
Definitely. We have to talk about that. Pseudoephedrine, for example, common decongestant.
Right, used to make meth.
Exactly. It became a primary ingredient for making methamphetamine, which led to those rules putting it behind the pharmacy counter. You have to ask for it now.
And what else?
We also see abuse of things like dextromethorphan, the cough suppressant. It has street names like robotripping.
Robotripping, seriously.
And even something as seemingly harmless as nasal sprays can lead to dependency, that rebound congestion effect if you use them too much. The pattern's clear. If it has an effect on the body, someone might find a way to misuse it.
Okay, so that covers the OTC drugs. Now let's shift gears to herbals and dietary supplements. This feels like where the rules change quite a bit.
Fundamentally, this is where the regulatory philosophy just takes a sharp turn, and that creates a pretty big concern for patient safety.
How so? What's the main difference?
Well, the key thing here is a law passed in 1994, the Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act, or DSHEA.
DSHEA, okay.
This act basically created a legal category for these products, supplements, that, unlike drugs, initially required no proof of effectiveness from the manufacturer before going to market.
No proof it works? Just that it's, what, safe?
Well, the manufacturer is responsible for ensuring safety, yes, but not efficacy. It wasn't actually until 2007 that the FDA brought in Good Manufacturing Practices, GMPs, for supplement makers.
Okay, 2007, that sounds like a positive step. What do GMPs cover?
They were crucial, yeah. But they mostly focus on product purity and consistency. So manufacturers now have to ensure the identity, composition, purity, and strength, basically, that the product contains what it says it contains, and it's free from contaminants, like, say, heavy metals or bacteria.
So GMPs are about quality control, making sure the pill has the herb it claims without extra nasty stuff. But still, no requirement to prove it does anything.
Largely, no. The burden of proof is different than for drugs.
Which means the consumer is still kind of relying on that feeling that natural automatically means safe, which we know just isn't true. Herbs are chemicals, they have effects.
Absolutely. They're active pharmacological agents. They can cause allergic reactions, toxic reactions, serious side effects. And the risk gets amplified because studies show over 40% of patients just don't tell their doctors or nurses about the supplements they're taking.
40%? Wow. That lack of transparency is terrifying when you think about potential interactions.
Exactly. Especially the high-risk herb-drug interactions.
Okay, let's hit some of the most critical ones that listeners really need to watch out for.
Top of the list has to be anything that increases bleeding risk. If you have patients on anticoagulants like warfarin,
Blood thinners.
right, they absolutely need to know that common herbs like chamomile, ginkgo, garlic, even ginger root at high doses can significantly increase that bleeding risk. It could potentially lead to a really dangerous hemorrhage.
That's huge. What else?
For patients on psychiatric meds, especially antidepressants like SSRIs, St. John's wort is a big one. It's notorious for interactions.
What can happen?
Combining St. John's wort with SSRIs can trigger a potentially life-threatening condition called serotonin syndrome. Really serious.
Right. Serotonin syndrome. Got it. Any others with major warnings?
Yeah, some herbs have specific toxicity warnings that even led to regulatory action. Kava, for instance, has been linked to possible liver toxicity.
Liver toxicity.
And remember ephedra, the weight loss supplement. That was banned federally back in 2004 because of links to heart attacks, strokes, serious cardiovascular events. The takeaway is crystal clear. These natural products are pharmacologically active. Treat them with respect.
Which brings us right to the practical application, the nursing process. If patients are self-medicating with any of this stuff, we, the healthcare professionals, have to be the safety net. And that starts with assessment, right?
Assessment is absolutely key. You need a truly comprehensive medication history. And I mean exhaustive.
Not just prescription drugs.
No, it has to include everything. OTCs, herbals, vitamins, minerals. And don't forget crucial lifestyle things like alcohol, tobacco, caffeine intake. If you don't specifically ask, the patient often won't volunteer it, maybe because they just don't think of a vitamin or an herb as a drug.
Good point. And it's also about their attitude, isn't it?
Yes, you have to assess their underlying attitude.
Yeah.
If they seem sort of too casual about non-prescription drugs, if they have this belief that they're fundamentally harmless.
That's a red flag.
Big red flag. That requires immediate education to try and prevent overuse or complications down the line.
And are there specific groups we need to be extra careful with?
Definitely. We have to prioritize high-risk groups. Patients with existing conditions, think diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, glaucoma. Also, pediatric patients and older adults.
Why them specifically?
Their bodies, especially their liver and kidney function, are just less forgiving. They can't handle drug or supplement toxicity as well as a healthy adult might.
Okay, so assessment is thorough. We've identified the risks. Now, implementation. What are the practical safety steps we need to hammer home? I'm thinking about basic stuff like measuring liquids.
Oh, absolutely critical, and often overlooked. We sometimes forget how inaccurate those kitchen teaspoons can be. They're not just a little off, they can be wildly off.
Yeah.
So the instruction has to be crystal clear. Never use household spoons or cups, ever. You must use only the device that comes with the medicine, the oral syringe or the dosing cup.
And how you measure matters too, right?
Yes. Put the cup on a flat surface, read the liquid level right at eye level, no holding it up in the air.
Got it. And for kids?
For children, always, always, always dose based on their current weight, not their age.
Right.
Weight gives you the most accurate, safest dose.
Weight, not age. Crucial. And we have to circle back to that double dosing issue.
Yes. Remind patients constantly. Read the active ingredients on all product labels. Don't just grab Tylenol and then grab an OTC sleep aid without checking if that also contains acetaminophen. It's such a common, dangerous mistake.
Okay. Are there other factors, maybe less obvious ones, that influence how people respond?
Yeah, we should touch on cultural and genetic factors too. They can play a role. For example, some cultural norms might influence whether a patient reports side effects.
Oh, so?
Well, research has shown, for instance, that in some patient groups, maybe like some Japanese patients, there might be a reluctance to report mild GI upset because complaining about minor discomfort might be seen as impolite. So you have to ask very directly.
Interesting. And genetics?
Genetics definitely play a part. Things like acetylation polymorphism, basically how fast your body metabolizes certain drugs, can vary quite a bit between different racial or ethnic groups.
So the same dose can hit differently.
Exactly. It influences how people respond to non-prescription drugs too. It just reinforces why a standard dose doesn't always have a standard effect. Individual variability is huge.
Okay. So when we're evaluating, what's the goal? What does success look like?
Ultimately, the patient-focused outcome is pretty straightforward. The patient can tell you they understand why correct dosing is important. They actually implement the safety measures we talked about, using the right device, reading labels, and they get the relief they were looking for, maybe less pain, maybe they can sleep better, maybe their cold symptoms clear up without having any adverse effects. That's the goal.
So this entire deep dive, it really boils down to one core message, doesn't it? Accessibility isn't the same as safety.
It absolutely isn't. OTCs, herbals, supplements, they are still potent substances. They have real risks, real potential for toxicity. Just because something is labeled natural or sold without a prescription, that offers zero guarantee of safety for infants, for children, for patients with underlying health problems.
Yeah.
Your clinical judgment is that final critical safety barrier.
So Here's the final thought, the provocation for you, the listener. You are that essential link in the chain of patient safety. The responsibility to uncover these hidden risks, it really rests on your shoulders as an informed professional.
Mhm.
Always ask about all the substances a patient is using, everything. And remember, if your patient does experience an adverse event from an OTC, an herbal, even a prescription drug, report it.
Please do. Report it to the FDA's MedWatch system. That phone number, keep it handy, is 800-332-1088.
800-332-1088. Using that helps make the whole system safer for everyone.
It really does.
Thank you for joining us for this really essential deep dive into pharmacology and patient safety today. We hope this knowledge helps you be safer, better informed, and ultimately provide better care.